The rain fell in relentless sheets upon the grey stones of Fenwood Manor on the day Liria's father drew his final breath. She knelt beside his bed, her slender fingers clasped around his weathered hand, feeling the warmth slowly abandon his body as autumn abandons the trees. Lord Edmund Fenwood had been her entire world, the only soul who had looked upon her with genuine affection since her mother's death when she was but 7 years of age. Now at 23, she faced a future as bleak and uncertain as the storm clouds gathering beyond the mullioned windows. Her stepmother, Lady Countess Fenwood, stood in the doorway, with an expression that might have passed for grief had Liria not known better. The woman's lips were pressed into a thin line, her pale eyes calculating even in this moment of supposed mourning. Beside her stood Victor, Constance's son from her first marriage, his handsome features arranged into a mask of false solemnity that failed to conceal the gleam of anticipation in his gaze. They had waited long for this day, Liria understood with sudden, terrible clarity. They had waited for her father to release his hold upon the estate, upon the fortune he had built through years of careful stewardship and fortunate investments. The funeral was a subdued affair, attended by few of the local gentry. Lord Edmund had been a quiet man who preferred his books and his daughter's company to the frivolities of society. As the vicar spoke words of comfort that fell hollow upon Liria's ears, she noticed the way Lady Constance's fingers drummed impatiently against her black silk skirts. The woman could scarcely contain her eagerness to hear the reading of the will, to claim what she believed was rightfully hers through marriage. The solicitor arrived 3 days hence, a wizened gentleman named Mr. Pemberton, who had served the Fenwood family for decades. He settled himself in the study that had been Lord Edmund's sanctuary, spreading documents across the mahogany desk with careful precision. Lady Constance positioned herself in the finest chair, Victor standing proprietarily at her shoulder. Liria took a place near the window, separate from them as she had always been, watching the late October wind strip the last leaves from the oak trees. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and began to read. The words washed over Liria in waves of legal terminology until certain phrases began to pierce through her grief. The manor house and its immediate lands were entailed to Victor as the eldest male heir, a provision that could not be altered. But her father's considerable fortune, his investments and personal property, these he had left entirely to Liria, with one condition that she should not marry without the consent of her appointed guardian until she reached the age of 25. The guardian he had named was his distant cousin, a gentleman none of them had ever met who resided in the north. The silence that followed this pronouncement was more terrible than any storm. Lady Constance's face transformed from pale expectation to mottled rage in the space of a heartbeat. Victor's jaw clenched so tightly that Liria could hear his teeth grinding together. And she, who had expected nothing, found herself suddenly wealthy, yet more vulnerable than she had ever been. That very evening, Lady Constance made her position abundantly clear. Liria was summoned to the drawing room where her stepmother sat like a queen upon her throne, Victor pacing behind her like a caged predator. The older woman's voice was cold as December frost when she spoke, informing Liria that while she might possess her father's fortune, she would not be permitted to remain at Fenwood Manor beyond a fortnight. The house was Victor's by law, and they would not suffer her presence to cast a shadow upon their rightful inheritance. Liria listened in stunned silence, her hands folded carefully in her lap to conceal their trembling. She had known that Constance held no affection for her, but she had not anticipated such swift and absolute rejection. When she dared to ask where she was expected to go, Lady Constance's smile was sharp as a blade. The woman suggested that perhaps Liria might find employment as a governess or companion. For what use was a fortune that could not be touched for 2 years, and what gentleman would wish to marry a girl with no family connections and no beauty to recommend her? The words struck deep, for they echoed thoughts Liria had harbored about herself since childhood. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her frame too tall and angular, her manner too serious and retiring. She had spent her youth in her father's library rather than at balls and assemblies, preferring the company of books to the cutting remarks of young ladies who found her peculiar and young gentlemen who found her entirely unremarkable. In the days that followed, Liria made what preparations she could. She packed her modest belongings, her mother's pearls, which were her only jewellery of value, and a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day. Mr. Pemberton had written to her guardian, but a reply could not be expected for weeks, given the distance and the approaching winter weather. She would need to find temporary lodging, some respectable situation that would preserve her reputation and her safety until arrangements could be made. It was Mrs. Hendricks, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Fenwoods since before Liria's birth, who provided the solution. The good woman had a sister who kept a small but respectable boarding house in the nearby market town of Asherton, a place where single ladies of quality but limited means might reside with propriety. Mrs. Hendricks wrote to her sister, and within days, a reply came confirming that a room would be available for Miss Fenwood at a rate she could afford from the small allowance Mr. Pemberton had arranged from her inheritance. On a grey morning that promised snow, Liria departed from the only home she had ever known. Lady Constance did not emerge from her chambers to bid farewell, and Victor merely watched from a window as the hired carriage bore Liria away down the long drive. Only Mrs. Hendricks wept, pressing a basket of provisions into Liria's hands and whispering that she had been the brightest light in that house and would be sorely missed by those with sense enough to appreciate her worth. The boarding house in Asherton proved to be a narrow three-story building wedged between a draper's shop and a printer's establishment. Mrs. Maple, the proprietress, was a comfortable woman of middle years with a kind face and shrewd eyes that seemed to take Liria's measure in an instant. She showed her new lodger to a small but clean room on the second floor, with a window overlooking the busy street below and a fireplace that, while modest, would keep the winter chill at bay. The other residents of the house were a varied collection of genteel poverty. There was Miss Thornbury, a spinster of uncertain age who taught piano to the daughters of merchants and shopkeepers; Mrs. Dalton, a widow whose husband had been a naval officer killed at Trafalgar, who supported herself through fine needlework; and Miss Perry, a young woman scarcely older than Liria herself, who served as a lady's companion to an elderly invalid and possessed a cheerful disposition that seemed proof against all hardship. In this humble establishment, Liria found something she had never known at Fenwood Manor under Lady Constance's reign. She found companionship, the simple fellowship of women who understood what it meant to make one's way in the world without the protection of family or fortune readily at hand. They took their meals together in the common dining room, sharing the modest but well-prepared fare that Mrs. Maple provided. They gathered in the parlour on long evenings, sewing and reading aloud and discussing the small events of their days with an earnestness that more fashionable society would have mocked. Winter settled upon Asherton with a vengeance. Snow fell in quantities that blocked the roads and transformed the town into an island isolated from the wider world. Letters could not get through, and the reply Liria awaited from her guardian failed to arrive. She found herself in a strange suspension, neither fully bereaved nor fully secure, waiting for a future that remained maddeningly uncertain. It was during this frozen interval that she first heard the name Thorian Blackwell, spoken in tones of awe and speculation. Miss Perry brought the gossip from the great house where she attended her elderly charge, reporting that the Earl of Ravenswood had taken up residence at Blackwell Hall for the winter months. The estate was some 5 miles distant from Asherton, a vast property that dominated the surrounding countryside. The Earl was known to be a man of considerable wealth and influence, though he rarely visited his northern holdings, preferring to spend his time in London or at his principal seat in Derbyshire. The local society, such as it was, immediately fell into a frenzy of speculation and social ambition. Every hostess with pretensions to gentility schemed to secure the Earl's attendance at some gathering or entertainment. Every mother with marriageable daughters began plotting campaigns to place their girls in his path. For the Earl of Ravenswood was not merely wealthy and titled. He was also unmarried, barely 30 years of age, and possessed of a reputation for cold intelligence and exacting standards that only made him more desirable in the eyes of ambitious families. Liria listened to these discussions with the detachment of one who knew such matters could never concern her. She had no introduction to the Earl, no means of entering the society that would bring her into his orbit, and no desire to join the ranks of marriage-minded females who saw in every eligible gentleman nothing more than a potential solution to their circumstances. She had seen too much of mercenary matches in her own family to harbour romantic illusions about the nature of marriage among the gentry. Yet fate, it seemed, had other designs. One bitter afternoon in early December, Liria ventured out despite the cold to visit the small lending library that served the town. She had exhausted her own small collection of books and craved new reading material to fill the long winter evenings. The streets were treacherous with ice, and she picked her way carefully along the frozen pathways, her worn cloak pulled tight against the wind. She was returning with her borrowed volumes tucked safely in her basket when disaster struck. A mail coach came careening around a corner, the horses wild-eyed and out of control on the slippery cobblestones. Liria had only a moment to register the danger before someone seized her roughly about the waist and hauled her backward out of the coach's path. They tumbled together into a snowbank, and she found herself lying in a most undignified position, half atop a gentleman whose identity she could not determine through the tangle of her bonnet strings and his greatcoat. He extricated them both with brisk efficiency, setting her on her feet and retrieving her scattered books from the snow before she had quite caught her breath. When she finally managed to look upon her rescuer's face, she found herself meeting eyes of such startling grey, they seemed almost silver in the winter light. He was tall, several inches above 6 feet, with dark hair visible beneath his beaver hat and features that were arresting rather than handsome, all sharp planes and angles that suggested both intelligence and an imperious temperament. He regarded her with an expression that was difficult to interpret, something between concern and calculation. When he spoke, his voice was deep and cultured, with an accent that spoke of the finest education and the highest circles of society. He inquired whether she was injured, whether she required assistance, whether she had far to walk in such dangerous conditions. Liria assured him that she was quite well, merely shaken, and that her lodging was but a few streets distant. Only as he handed her the rescued books did she notice the ring upon his hand, the signet that bore the crest of Ravenswood. This, then, was the Earl himself, the man who had become the chief subject of gossip and speculation throughout Asherton. And he had just saved her from what might well have been a fatal accident, though he could have no notion of her identity or circumstances. She stammered her thanks, desperately aware of how bedraggled she must appear, how utterly inappropriate it was for her to be speaking with him at all without proper introduction. But the Earl seemed unconcerned with such niceties. Instead, he asked her name, and when she hesitated, he smiled slightly and observed that surely it would not violate any code of propriety to tell him whom he had just rescued from imminent trampling. She told him, giving only her Christian name and that of her late father. She did not mention Fenwood Manor or her connection to that estate, for she was no longer certain she had any right to claim it. Something flickered in the Earl's expression at the mention of Lord Edmund's name, a recognition that surprised her. Had he known her father? But before she could inquire, he was bowing with a formality that seemed almost ironic, given that they had just been sprawled together in a snowbank, and taking his leave with an assurance that he hoped she would suffer no ill effects from the experience. Liria walked the remaining distance to her lodging in a daze. She had met the Earl of Ravenswood under the most absurd and improper circumstances imaginable, and he had shown her nothing but courtesy and concern. It was entirely meaningless, she told herself firmly. Gentlemen of his rank performed small acts of gallantry, as a matter of course, and he would forget the entire incident within the hour. But she found that she could not forget it quite so easily. That evening, as she sat with her fellow lodgers in Mrs. Maple's parlour, she found her thoughts returning again and again to those strange silver eyes, to the strength of the arms that had pulled her from danger, to the hint of amusement in his voice when he had coaxed her name from her. When Miss Perry launched into fresh speculation about the Earl and his reasons for rusticating in the north during the height of the London season, Liria held her tongue and bent her head over her needlework, unwilling to reveal that she had actually encountered the man himself. The very next morning, an extraordinary thing occurred. A footman arrived at Mrs. Maple's establishment dressed in livery that proclaimed him to be from Blackwell Hall. He bore a letter addressed to Miss Liria Fenwood, sealed with the Ravenswood crest. Mrs. Maple brought it up to Liria's room herself, her curiosity barely contained, clearly expecting to be taken into her lodger's confidence. Liria waited until she was alone to break the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was written in a bold, decisive hand and contained an invitation that left her breathless with astonishment. The Earl of Ravenswood requested the pleasure of Miss Fenwood's company at a small dinner party he was hosting at Blackwell Hall in 3 days' time. He mentioned their chance encounter of the previous day and expressed his hope that she had suffered no injury. The invitation was perfectly proper, including instructions that a carriage would be sent to collect her and return her safely to her lodging. She read the letter 3 times, searching for some explanation that made sense. Earls did not invite impoverished, unknown young women to dine at their estates on the basis of a single meeting in the street. It was unprecedented, inexplicable, and thoroughly improper for her to accept without a chaperone or some respectable connection to justify her presence. Yet even as these thoughts raced through her mind, she knew that she would accept. Something in her, some quality she had not known she possessed, refused to let fear or propriety deny her this one extraordinary opportunity. She composed her reply with painstaking care, accepting the invitation with appropriate gratitude and formality. The footman departed with her letter, and Liria was left to contemplate what she had just done. Miss Perry was beside herself with excitement when the news inevitably spread through the boarding house. Mrs. Maple fretted over the propriety of the situation until Liria pointed out that she would be attending a dinner party, not an assignation, and that surely the Earl of Ravenswood's household would contain sufficient numbers to constitute adequate chaperoning. The question of what to wear presented a significant challenge. Liria's wardrobe was modest in the extreme, her few gowns serviceable but far from fashionable. It was Mrs. Dalton who came to her rescue, revealing that she had brought with her from her former life several dresses of excellent quality that no longer suited her circumstances, but which she had been unable to part with for sentimental reasons. With a generosity that brought tears to Liria's eyes, the widow offered to alter one of these gowns to fit her fellow lodger. The dress was of deep midnight blue silk with simple but elegant lines. Mrs. Dalton worked upon it with the skill of a professional modiste, taking in the bodice and shortening the hem, adding small touches of lace at the sleeves that had been saved from another garment. When Liria tried the finished result, she scarcely recognized herself in Mrs. Maple's looking-glass. The color brought out the depth of her dark eyes and lent her pale complexion a luminous quality. For perhaps the first time in her life, she looked like a woman who might belong in a drawing-room with the Earl of Ravenswood. The evening of the dinner arrived with agonizing slowness. The carriage from Blackwell Hall appeared precisely at the appointed hour, a handsome vehicle with the Ravenswood crest emblazoned upon the door and a driver bundled against the cold. Liria climbed inside with her heart hammering so fiercely she feared it might be visible through the silk of her borrowed gown. The interior was luxuriously appointed, with velvet cushions and fur robes to ward off the chill. As they drove through the frozen countryside, she watched the landscape transform from the modest streets of Asherton to the vast parkland that surrounded the Earl's estate. Blackwell Hall rose from the winter darkness like something from a medieval romance, all soaring towers and crenellated walls softened by centuries of additions and modifications. Light blazed from dozens of windows, and as the carriage drew up before the main entrance, Liria could see that despite the Earl's description of a small gathering, there was nothing modest about the establishment itself. The hall was attended by liveried footmen who handed her down from the carriage with practiced courtesy, as though impoverished young women from boarding houses arrived to dine with earls every evening. A butler whose dignity was absolute conducted her through halls hung with portraits of long-dead Blackwells, past rooms furnished with a magnificence that made Fenwood Manor seem like a cottage by comparison. They arrived at last at a drawing-room where a fire roared in a marble fireplace large enough to roast an ox, and there, rising from a chair with fluid grace, was the Earl of Ravenswood himself. He was dressed in evening clothes that must have been tailored by Weston or some equally celebrated practitioner of that art, the dark coat fitting his broad shoulders with precision that spoke of both excellent craftsmanship and excellent physique beneath. In the candlelight, his features were even more striking than they had been in the harsh winter daylight, all aristocratic planes and that mouth that seemed perpetually on the verge of either a smile or a sardonic observation. He greeted her with a formality that gradually warmed as he led her to a chair near the fire and offered her a glass of wine. To her surprise, no other guests arrived. It became apparent that the dinner party consisted of themselves alone, a circumstance so irregular that Liria felt she ought to make some protest or express some concern. Yet the Earl seemed entirely unconcerned with propriety, and there was something in his manner, a directness combined with an assumption that his word was law, that made objection seem both futile and somehow provincial. They dined in a room that could have accommodated 50 guests, but which felt strangely intimate, with only the two of them seated at one end of a table that stretched away into shadows. The meal was magnificent, course after course of dishes that Liria had rarely encountered even in her father's prime. But it was the conversation that truly astonished her. The Earl did not indulge in social pleasantries or empty flattery. Instead, he asked her questions, real questions that demonstrated he had made inquiries about her circumstances and was genuinely interested in her answers. He spoke of her father with respect, revealing that they had met in London some years previous and had corresponded occasionally on matters of agricultural improvement and estate management. Lord Edmund had impressed him as a man of intelligence and principle, and he had been saddened to learn of his death. This admission, delivered with what seemed like genuine feeling, created a connection between them that Liria had not anticipated. As the evening progressed, she found herself speaking with an openness that was entirely unlike her usual reserved manner. There was something about the Earl, about the focused intensity of his attention, that drew words from her like water from a well. She told him of her love of reading, of the years spent in her father's library absorbing everything from philosophy to poetry, to treatises on scientific subjects. She confessed her sense of displacement, of being a creature ill-suited to the world of balls and social niceties that was supposed to be her natural habitat. To her amazement, he seemed to understand. He spoke of his own education, of tutors who had recognized and cultivated his intellectual gifts. He mentioned the loneliness of always being the cleverest person in any room, of the burden of expectations that came with title and wealth. He made her laugh with wry observations about the absurdities of society, the pretensions and machinations that passed for civilized behavior among the ton. By the time they retired from the dining room to take tea in the drawing room, Liria felt as though she had known him far longer than a few hours. It was late when the carriage returned her to Mrs. Maple's establishment. Liria climbed the stairs to her small room in a daze, uncertain whether the evening had truly happened, or whether she had somehow dreamed it into existence. She lay awake long into the night, replaying every word, every glance, every moment of the extraordinary encounter. She knew with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying that something significant had occurred. But what that something was, and what it might mean for her uncertain future, she could not begin to guess. The next morning brought another surprise. The footman from Blackwell Hall appeared once more, this time bearing not a letter, but a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside, Liria found a collection of books, volumes that she had mentioned during the previous evening's conversation as ones she had long wished to read, but had never been able to obtain. There was no note, but none was necessary. The Earl had listened to every word she had spoken, and he had acted upon that knowledge with a generosity that took her breath away. Days turned into weeks, and a pattern established itself that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of society. The Earl would send an invitation, sometimes for dinner, sometimes merely for tea or an afternoon call. Liria would accept, and they would spend hours in conversation that ranged across every subject imaginable. He lent her books from his extensive library, and they would discuss them with the intensity of scholars rather than the casual interest of social acquaintances. He sought her opinion on estate matters, on investments he was considering, on political questions of the day. He treated her not as a woman whose primary value lay in her beauty or connections, but as an intellectual equal worthy of serious engagement. The town naturally buzzed with speculation and gossip. Miss Perry reported that the Earl's behavior was the subject of endless discussion among the local gentry, with theories ranging from the charitable to the scandalous. Some suggested that he was merely amusing himself during a dull winter in the country. Others whispered darker possibilities, hinting that no earl paid such attention to a penniless young woman without expecting something improper in return. Liria tried to ignore the gossip, but it was impossible to remain entirely unaffected. She knew that her reputation was at risk, that every visit to Blackwell Hall, however proper the circumstances, added fuel to the fire of speculation. Yet, she could not bring herself to refuse the Earl's invitations, to deny herself the one bright element in her otherwise circumscribed existence. She told herself that they were friends, that their connection was based on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility rather than any romantic attachment. But she was lying to herself, and she knew it. Somewhere in the midst of those long conversations and shared moments of laughter, something had shifted in her heart. She had begun to feel for the Earl of Ravenswood, an emotion that went far beyond friendship or gratitude. It was a feeling that grew stronger with every meeting, every smile, every moment of connection. And it was a feeling that terrified her precisely because she could not afford to indulge it. The Earl was so far above her in rank and fortune that any romantic attachment between them was impossible. He would be expected to marry a woman of equal standing, someone who could bring political connections or vast wealth to the union, someone who could fulfill the role of Countess of Ravenswood with grace and confidence. She was nobody, the rejected daughter of a minor gentleman, with no fortune she could access and no family to support her claims to respectability. That he enjoyed her company, that he seemed to value her mind, meant nothing in the face of such overwhelming practical realities. February arrived with a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the roads passable once more. And with the thaw came a letter, finally, from her guardian. Mr. James Hartwell wrote from his home in Yorkshire, expressing his deep regret at the delay in responding to Mr. Pemberton's communication. He had been travelling on the continent when news of Lord Edmund's death had reached England, and he had only recently returned to discover his appointment as Miss Fenwood's guardian. Mr. Hartwell's letter was kind in tone, expressing sympathy for her loss and assuring her that he took his responsibilities seriously. He proposed that she should come to stay with his family at Hartwell Park until she reached her majority or married, whichever came first. His household included his wife and 3 daughters, and he felt certain that Liria would be comfortable there and might even benefit from the companionship of young women her own age. He would send his own carriage to collect her, and she should prepare to depart Asherton within a fortnight. Liria read the letter with mixed emotions. Relief that her situation was finally resolved, warred with a sense of loss that surprised her with its intensity. Leaving Asherton meant leaving the small but genuine friendships she had formed at Mrs. Maple's establishment. It meant abandoning the precarious independence she had begun to discover in herself. And most significantly, it meant severing whatever connection existed between herself and the Earl of Ravenswood. She penned a reply to Mr. Hartwell, accepting his generous offer with appropriate gratitude. She then sat down to compose a far more difficult letter, one to the Earl informing him of her impending departure and thanking him for his kindness during her stay in the neighbourhood. The words seemed inadequate to express what she felt, but she dared not reveal the true depth of her emotions. She sealed the letter with a sense of finality, as though closing a chapter of her life before it had properly begun. The Earl's response arrived by return of post, and its contents left her stunned. He did not send congratulations on her improved circumstances or polite wishes for her future happiness. Instead, he wrote with an urgency that was entirely unlike his usual controlled manner. He asked, almost demanded, that she meet with him at Blackwell Hall before she departed. He had something of great importance to discuss with her, something that could not be committed to paper or delayed until a more convenient time. Against her better judgment, Liria agreed. On a grey afternoon 3 days before her scheduled departure, she made her way to Blackwell Hall one final time. The Earl met her not in the formal drawing-room, but in his private study, a room lined with books and filled with the tools of estate management. He dismissed the servants, and they were alone in a way that was entirely improper and which would have scandalized the matrons of Asherton had they known. He did not waste time with preliminaries. Standing before her with an intensity that was almost frightening, he asked her a question that changed everything. He asked if she had any idea how extraordinary she was, how rare it was to find a woman who could engage with ideas rather than merely spout the conventional wisdom of society. He asked if she understood that in all his 30 years, in all his travels and encounters with the cream of English aristocracy, he had never met anyone who challenged and delighted him as she did. Liria could only stare at him, unable to process what she was hearing. And then, with a directness that was characteristically his, the Earl of Ravenswood asked her to marry him. The proposal was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything she had been telling herself about the impossibility of such a connection, that she could not immediately form a coherent response. He continued speaking, his words tumbling out with uncharacteristic lack of polish. He told her that he had known from their first meeting, when he had pulled her from the path of that runaway coach, that she was different from every other woman he had encountered. He had made inquiries, learned of her circumstances, and had devised the dinner party as an excuse to know her better. What he had discovered in those subsequent meetings had only confirmed his initial impression. She was intelligent, principled, genuine in a way that was vanishingly rare in his world of calculated marriages and mercenary alliances. He did not care that she had no fortune or connections. He had wealth enough for both of them, and his rank was secure enough that he could marry where he chose without fear of social repercussions. He wanted a wife who could be his partner in the truest sense, someone he could talk to, someone who would make his life richer rather than merely more socially convenient. He acknowledged that the proposal was sudden, that she had no reason to believe he held such feelings for her, but he could not let her depart for Yorkshire without making his intentions clear. If she could not love him, if she felt nothing beyond friendship and gratitude, then he would accept her refusal and trouble her no more. But if there was any chance, any possibility that she might come to care for him as he had come to care for her, then he begged her to consider his proposal seriously. Liria listened to this extraordinary speech with tears streaming down her face, unable to speak for the emotions warring within her. Joy and disbelief fought for dominance, along with a lingering fear that this was somehow a cruel joke or a misunderstanding that would dissolve upon examination. But when she looked into the Earl's eyes, into those remarkable silver depths, she saw nothing but sincerity and a vulnerability that she had never expected to see in a man so powerful and controlled. She found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. She told him that she had not dared to hope for such an outcome, that she had convinced herself that her feelings were impossible and inappropriate. She confessed that she had come to care for him more than was wise, that leaving Asherton had filled her with a grief out of all proportion to the brevity of their acquaintance. And then, with a courage she had not known she possessed, she told him yes. Yes, she would marry him. Yes, she would be his Countess. Yes to everything he offered, and everything that would mean. The Earl's response was to cross the space between them in 2 strides and take her in his arms with a fervor that left no doubt about the genuineness of his feelings. He kissed her with a passion that was entirely improper and absolutely perfect, and Liria felt something within her that had been frozen and dormant suddenly burst into blazing life. When they finally drew apart, both breathless and slightly dazed, he was smiling with an expression of pure triumph and joy. The practical arrangements proceeded with a speed that left Liria's head spinning. The Earl immediately wrote to Mr. Hartwell, introducing himself and requesting permission to marry his ward. Given that Liria was under guardianship until age 25, such permission was legally necessary. But the Earl's letter was so respectful, his offer so advantageous, and his rank so elevated that Mr. Hartwell's response, when it came, was enthusiastically approving. Mr. Pemberton was summoned to Blackwell Hall to draw up the marriage settlement. The Earl insisted that Liria's inheritance remain entirely under her own control, settled upon her in such a way that not even marriage could divest her of it. He further settled upon her a jointure that would ensure her financial security regardless of what happened to him. The generosity and thoughtfulness of these arrangements moved Liria deeply, demonstrating as they did that the Earl valued her independence and wished to protect her even from any potential abuse of his own power. The announcement of the engagement created a sensation that reverberated far beyond Asherton. The Earl of Ravenswood, one of the most eligible bachelors in England, was to marry an unknown young woman of no particular family or fortune. The London papers picked up the news, and speculation ran rampant about the mysterious Miss Fenwood, who had captured such a notable prize. Some praised the Earl for marrying where his heart led, rather than following mercenary considerations. Others criticized him for degrading his line with such an unequal match. In Asherton itself, opinion was violently divided. Those who had known Liria during her months at Mrs. Maple's establishment were generally pleased, seeing in the match a fairy tale ending for a young woman who had endured real hardship. But others, particularly those who had daughters they had hoped to thrust into the Earl's path, were bitter with envy and disappointment. The gossip that had been merely speculative now turned vicious, with dark hints about what Liria must have done to secure such an advantageous match. The Earl's response to such gossip was swift and definitive. He made it clear through both word and action that any slight to his betrothed would be considered a slight to himself, and that those who valued his goodwill would do well to extend every courtesy to the future Countess of Ravenswood. The force of his personality and the weight of his rank were sufficient to silence most of the more overt criticism, though Liria knew that whispers would persist in corners where the Earl's influence did not reach. The wedding was planned for early March, a relatively short engagement that raised eyebrows, but which the Earl insisted upon. He had waited 30 years to find the woman he wished to marry, he declared, and he saw no reason to wait months longer once he had found her. The ceremony would take place in the chapel at Blackwell Hall, with only a small number of guests in attendance. Mr. Hartwell and his family would come from Yorkshire, and a few of the Earl's closest friends and relations would make the journey north despite the season. In the weeks preceding the wedding, Liria experienced a transformation that was both external and internal. The Earl insisted that she be properly outfitted as befitted her future station. A modiste was summoned from London, bringing with her fabrics and fashion plates that made Liria's eyes widen. The woman created a trousseau of stunning beauty, gowns that transformed Liria from a plain, overlooked young woman into someone who looked as though she might indeed belong beside an earl. But the more profound transformation was in Liria's understanding of herself. For the first time in her life, she was valued not despite her intellectual nature, but because of it. The Earl did not want her to hide her intelligence or pretend to be less than she was. He actively encouraged her to express her opinions, to engage with the management of his estates, to take an active role in the life they would build together. This acceptance, this celebration of qualities she had been taught to view as defects, worked upon her like spring sunshine upon frozen ground. Yet even as happiness bloomed within her, Liria could not entirely escape the shadows of her past. One afternoon, as she was being fitted for her wedding gown, a visitor was announced who sent a chill through her newly found joy. Lady Constance Fenwood had arrived at Blackwell Hall, accompanied by Victor, and was requesting an audience with the Earl and his betrothed. The Earl received them in the formal drawing-room with Liria at his side. Lady Constance had clearly dressed for the occasion in her finest garments, and her manner was all gracious condescension as she congratulated Liria on her extraordinary good fortune. Victor stood silent beside his mother, his expression carefully neutral, but Liria could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed the magnificent surroundings and the Earl's evident devotion to his intended bride. The purpose of their visit became clear soon enough. Lady Constance had come to mend fences, to establish a connection with the future Countess of Ravenswood that might prove advantageous to herself and her son. She spoke warmly of Lord Edmund, of what a devoted father he had been to his dear Liria, of how the family had grieved his loss. She made no mention of the circumstances under which she had expelled Liria from Fenwood Manor, and her manner suggested that their previous interactions had been characterized by nothing but affection and familial warmth. Liria listened to this performance with a sense of unreality. The woman who had rejected her so completely, who had made it clear that she was unwelcome and unwanted, now sought to claim kinship and connection. It would have been amusing had it not been so painful, this demonstration of how quickly attitudes shifted when circumstances changed. The Earl, however, was no fool. His inquiries into Liria's background had been thorough, and he knew precisely how Lady Constance had treated his betrothed. He received the woman's overtures with a courtesy so cold it was almost an insult, making it clear through tone and manner that while he would not create an open breach, neither would he forget how Liria had been used. When Lady Constance hinted that perhaps she and Victor might be invited to the wedding, the Earl responded with regret that the guest list had been finalized and was limited to those who had shown true friendship and loyalty to his future wife. After they departed, Lady Constance's false warmth cracking slightly at the edges with barely concealed frustration, the Earl drew Liria into his arms and asked if she was well. She found herself laughing through tears, marveling at how completely her world had transformed. The woman who had once held complete power over her future now came as a supplicant, and Liria discovered that she felt not triumph, but a kind of sad pity for the desperation that drove such behavior. The Earl pressed a kiss to her forehead and murmured that she had a generous heart, more generous than such treatment deserved. But he made her a promise in that moment, his voice fierce with protective intensity. No one would ever make her feel less than she was again. No one would have the power to reject or dismiss her. As his Countess, she would have the protection of his name, his rank, and his considerable influence. And more than that, she would have his love, freely given and absolutely steadfast. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, one of those early spring mornings when winter's grip finally loosens and the promise of renewal fills the air. Liria woke in her chamber at Blackwell Hall, where she had been residing as a guest in the weeks before the ceremony. The servants had been treating her with a deference that still felt strange, and Mrs. Thornby, the housekeeper, had taken it upon herself to ensure that every detail of the day would be perfect. As she was dressed in her wedding gown, a confection of ivory silk and Brussels lace that made her look like someone from a painting, Liria thought of her mother and father. She wished they could have been present to see this day, to know that their daughter had found not just security, but genuine love. The miniature portrait she had carried from Fenwood Manor sat on the dressing table, and she touched it gently before leaving the room, feeling as though she carried their blessing with her. The chapel at Blackwell Hall was a medieval gem, all soaring arches and jewel-toned windows that cast coloured light across the ancient stones. The small gathering of guests rose as Liria entered on Mr. Hartwell's arm. Her guardian had proven to be a kindly gentleman, whose genuine pleasure in her good fortune had been touching. His wife and daughters beamed at her from their pew, and she caught sight of Mrs. Maple, Miss Perry, Mrs. Dalton, and Miss Thornbury, whom the Earl had insisted be invited as recognition of the friendship they had shown her in difficult times. But it was the Earl who commanded her attention, standing at the altar in his wedding finery, with an expression that took her breath away. There was nothing controlled or sardonic in his face now. He looked at her, as though she were the answer to every question he had ever asked, as though her appearance in his life was a miracle he had not dared hope for. When she reached his side and placed her hand in his, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers, and knew that he was as moved by this moment as she was herself. The ceremony proceeded with the timeless words that had bound countless couples before them. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and the Earl drew her into his arms for their first kiss as husband and wife, Liria felt something settle into place deep within her soul. She was no longer the rejected daughter, no longer the unwanted burden. She was Liria Blackwell, Countess of Ravenswood, beloved wife of an extraordinary man who had chosen her not for duty or advantage, but for herself alone. The wedding breakfast was a joyous affair, informal by the standards of the ton, but all the more genuine for its intimacy. The Earl made a toast to his new wife that had more than one guest reaching for handkerchiefs, praising her intelligence, her courage, and the light she had brought into his life. Liria responded with a grace that surprised even herself, thanking those who had shown her kindness and expressing her determination to be worthy of the trust her husband had placed in her. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to depart, the Earl drew Liria aside into the library, the room where they had spent so many hours in conversation before their engagement. He presented her with a gift, a small velvet box that contained a ring that had belonged to his mother. The Countess of Ravenswood had been, by all accounts, a woman of great character and intelligence, and the Earl told Liria that his mother would have loved her, would have recognized in her the qualities that made for true partnership rather than mere ornament. Liria slipped the ring onto her finger beside her new wedding band and found herself overwhelmed with gratitude and wonder. 6 months ago she had been grieving and alone, convinced that her future held nothing but diminishment and dependence. Now she stood in this magnificent house as its mistress, married to a man who valued every quality she possessed. It seemed impossible, like something from the novels she had devoured in her father's library. Yet it was real as the warm weight of the Earl's arms around her and the solid beat of his heart beneath her cheek. That evening, as they dined together for the first time as husband and wife, Thorian insisted that she begin calling him by his given name rather than his title. They were partners now, equals in the truest sense that marriage between two such disparate ranks could allow. He wanted their private life to be one of genuine intimacy, not the formal distance that characterized so many aristocratic unions. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and discovery. Liria took up her duties as Countess with a determination to justify her husband's faith in her. The household staff, initially uncertain about the new mistress who had come from such obscure origins, quickly learned that Lady Ravenswood possessed both intelligence and kindness. She was interested in everything, from the management of the kitchens to the condition of the tenant farms, and she brought fresh perspectives to problems that had persisted for years. Thorian delighted in having a wife who could discuss estate management with understanding and offer insights he had not considered. They would spend evenings going over account books together, debating the merits of various agricultural improvements, planning renovations to tenant cottages. It was not the romantic idyll that society might have expected from a love match, but it was deeply satisfying to both of them, this meeting of minds as well as hearts. Spring advanced into summer, and with the warmer weather came visitors. The Earl's closest friends made the journey north to meet the new Countess, and Liria found herself submitted to inspection by the people whose opinions mattered to her husband. She approached these encounters with trepidation, aware that she was being judged and measured against expectations she might not meet. But she discovered that Thorian's friends were, like him, people of substance rather than mere fashion. Lord Marcus Ashford arrived with his wife Catherine, a couple who had known the Earl since their university days. Lady Ashford was a lively woman who immediately put Liria at ease, confessing that she had been terrified when she first married into the aristocracy and had made countless social blunders before finding her footing. The two women formed a swift friendship, and Catherine's acceptance did much to ease Liria's way into society. It was Lord Ashford who revealed over port one evening after the ladies had withdrawn that Thorian had been transformed by his marriage. The Earl had always been brilliant, but also somewhat cold and detached, using his intelligence as a shield against genuine connection. His friends had worried that he might never find someone who could penetrate that armor, that he would make a conventional match and spend his life in intellectual isolation. Seeing him with Liria, seeing the warmth and humor that she drew from him, was like witnessing the thawing of winter into spring. Not all reactions were so positive. When the Earl and his Countess made their first appearance in London for the autumn session of Parliament, they encountered the full force of society's judgment. The grand ladies of the ton, many of whom had harboured ambitions regarding the eligible Earl of Ravenswood, were not inclined to welcome the woman who had captured him so unexpectedly. At her first ball, Liria endured snubs, both subtle and overt, as matrons who should have acknowledged her turned away, and young ladies whispered behind their fans. It was a trial that would have broken someone with less courage, but Liria had survived worse rejections than those of fashionable ladies who knew nothing of real hardship. She held her head high and remained at her husband's side with quiet dignity, and gradually she found allies in unexpected places. The Duchess of Moreland, a formidable woman whose good opinion was much sought after, made a point of seeking out the new Countess and engaging her in conversation about a recent philosophical text they had both read. The Duchess's approval opened doors that had been closed, and Liria began to establish her own place in society. She would never be a leader of fashion or a hostess whose invitations were desperately sought. But she became known as a woman of intelligence and character, someone whose conversation was actually worth having. The Earl's political allies discovered that his wife could be a valuable asset, her quick mind and genuine interest in policy making her someone they could trust with confidence. Yet it was not in the ballrooms and drawing rooms of London that Liria found her true calling. During that first autumn at Blackwell Hall, she had observed that the village school was in poor condition, and that many children of the estate workers received no education at all. The idea took root in her mind that she might establish a proper school, one that would provide instruction not just in basic letters and numbers, but in skills that could improve the children's prospects in life. When she proposed the idea to Victorian, he was immediately supportive. He provided funds for the construction of a school building and the hiring of qualified teachers, but it was Liria who threw herself into the project with passion, working with the vicar and the village elders to develop a curriculum that would serve the community's actual needs. She visited the school regularly, getting to know the children and their families, using her own education to develop supplementary materials and programs. The school became her great achievement, the thing that gave her purpose beyond her role as the Earl's wife, and it established her in the community in a way that no amount of gracious condescension could have accomplished. The tenant farmers and village workers saw that their Countess genuinely cared about their welfare, that she was willing to invest time and energy in improving their children's futures. The loyalty and affection she earned through this work became one of the Earl's most valuable assets in managing his estates. Time passed with the strange acceleration that characterizes happy lives. The first year of marriage became 2, then 3. Liria grew into her role as Countess with increasing confidence, and her marriage to Victorian deepened into something that went beyond the initial passion of new love. They became partners in the truest sense, two people who had found in each other not just romantic fulfillment, but genuine friendship and intellectual companionship. There were challenges, of course. Liria suffered 2 miscarriages in the first 3 years of marriage, losses that grieved both her and Victorian deeply. The pressure to provide an heir, never explicitly stated but always present, weighed heavily on her. But Victorian refused to allow these tragedies to become a source of distance between them. He mourned with her, held her through the darkest moments, and made it clear that while he hoped for children, her health and happiness mattered more to him than the continuation of his line. It was in the 4th year of their marriage that Liria's joy was finally completed by the birth of a healthy son. The labor was long and difficult, and there were hours when Victorian feared he might lose both wife and child. But Liria proved to have the same courage in childbirth that she had shown in facing every other challenge in her life. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, both parents wept with relief and overwhelming love. They named him Edmund, after Liria's father, and the boy proved to be a happy combination of both parents. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's sharp features, and as he grew it became clear that he had inherited intelligence from both sides. Victorian proved to be a devoted father, involving himself in his son's upbringing in a way that was unusual for men of his rank. He wanted Edmund to know that intelligence and curiosity were to be celebrated, that the world was full of wonders to be explored and understood. 2 years after Edmund's birth, a daughter arrived, whom they named Catherine after Lady Ashford. The little girl was bright and cheerful, with none of the reserve that had characterized her mother's childhood. She grew up surrounded by love and security, never knowing what it was to feel unwanted or less than valued. Watching her daughter flourish, Liria sometimes reflected on how different her own childhood had been, and felt profound gratitude that she could give her children something better. As the years accumulated, bringing with them the small joys and sorrows that make up a life, Liria sometimes thought back to that desperate winter in Asherton, to the girl she had been who had felt so lost and rejected. It seemed like another life, something that had happened to someone else entirely. She had been transformed not just by her marriage, but by the love that had allowed her to transform herself, to become the woman she had always had the potential to be. Yet one piece of her past remained unresolved. Fenwood Manor still stood under the control of Lady Constance and Victor, and Liria had not returned there since her father's death. She had no desire to revisit the place that held so many painful memories, and Victorian respected her wish to leave that chapter closed. They lived primarily at Blackwell Hall, with visits to London for the season and occasional trips to the Earl's other properties. Fenwood and its inhabitants existed at the periphery of their lives, acknowledged but not engaged with. Then came news that changed everything. Lady Constance had died suddenly of an apoplexy, and Victor, now master of Fenwood in his own right, had been badly injured in a hunting accident. The estate was in chaos, with no one to provide direction and creditors beginning to circle. Mr. Pemberton wrote to inform Liria of the situation, suggesting that as her father's daughter, she might wish to know of these developments. Liria's first response was to feel nothing at all. Lady Constance had been cruel to her, and Victor had stood by while his mother inflicted that cruelty. Why should she care what became of them, or of Fenwood? But as she sat with the letter in her hand, other feelings began to surface. Fenwood had been her father's home, the place where he had built his life and raised his daughter. It represented her childhood, both the happy years before her mother's death and the difficult ones that followed. She showed the letter to Victorian, and they discussed the situation over dinner that evening. He made it clear that the decision was entirely hers. If she wished to let Fenwood go to ruin, if she wanted nothing to do with the place or the people associated with it, he would support that choice completely. But if some part of her wanted to intervene, to perhaps save her father's legacy from destruction, then he would support that as well. After much thought, Liria decided that she would visit Fenwood, if only to see for herself what had become of the place. Victorian insisted on accompanying her, and they made the journey on a crisp autumn day that reminded Liria painfully of her father's funeral. The manor looked shabbier than she remembered, the grounds neglected, and the building itself showing signs of deferred maintenance. It was clear that Victor had been living beyond his means, spending money on his own pleasures rather than investing in the property. They were received by Mrs. Hendricks, the elderly housekeeper who had been kind to Liria, and who still maintained her position despite the household's deterioration. The good woman wept to see her former nursling returned as the Countess of Ravenswood, exclaiming over how fine she looked and how proud Lord Edmund would have been. She led them to the drawing-room where Victor lay on a sofa, his leg in splints and his face bearing the marks of prolonged pain and worry. Victor's greeting was stiff with humiliation and pride barely concealed. He knew why they had come, knew that his circumstances had reduced him to accepting help from the woman his mother had rejected. Liria looked at him. This man who had once seemed so confident and superior, now broken and desperate, and felt something unexpected stir within her. Not triumph, not satisfaction at his reduced state, but a kind of weary compassion. She asked him directly about the estate's financial situation, and after some hesitation, he confessed the truth. His mother had spent lavishly during her years as mistress of Fenwood, convinced that they deserved the finest of everything. He himself had been equally profligate, maintaining a lifestyle he could not afford in an attempt to establish himself among the local gentry. Now the bills were coming due, and he had no means to pay them. The estate would likely have to be sold to satisfy his debts, and he would be left with nothing. Victorian began to ask pointed questions about the specifics of the debts and the condition of the property. As Victor responded, it became clear that while the situation was serious, it was not irredeemable. The estate itself was fundamentally sound, and with proper management and an infusion of capital, it could be restored to profitability. But Victor had neither the knowledge nor the resources to accomplish such a turnaround. That evening, back in their rooms at the inn where they were staying, Liria and Victorian discussed what they had learned. She found herself thinking about her father, about the years he had spent building Fenwood into a prosperous estate. It seemed wrong that his work should be destroyed through the incompetence and greed of others. And despite everything Victor and his mother had done to her, she could not quite bring herself to stand by and watch her father's legacy crumble. She proposed a solution to Victorian, one that he refined with his characteristic analytical intelligence. They would pay off Victor's debts and provide capital to restore the estate, but in return Victor would cede management of Fenwood to them. He could continue to live there as the nominal master, but all significant decisions would be made by stewards, answerable to the Earl and Countess of Ravenswood. When Edmund came of age, he would inherit Fenwood in addition to his father's properties, uniting the estates under one family once more. It was a generous offer given Victor's treatment of Liria, but it served multiple purposes. It preserved her father's legacy, it provided security for the tenants and servants who depended on Fenwood, and it demonstrated the kind of magnanimity that befitted their position. Victor had little choice but to accept, though his pride clearly chafed at the arrangement. In the years that followed, Fenwood was gradually restored under the careful management that Victorian's stewards provided. The estate became profitable once more, and the physical property was repaired and improved. Victor remained there, a somewhat pathetic figure who had learned too late the consequences of his own choices, but he was treated with courtesy and provided for more mercy than he had shown to Liria in her time of need. The resolution of the Fenwood situation brought a kind of closure to Liria's past. She had faced those who had rejected her from a position of strength rather than weakness, and she had chosen compassion over revenge. It reinforced for her the lesson that she had been learning throughout her marriage, that true power lay not in dominance or retribution, but in the ability to choose grace even when harshness might be justified. As she entered her 30s, Liria had become everything that Lady Constance had claimed she could never be. She was beautiful, not in the conventional sense perhaps, but with the kind of beauty that comes from confidence and inner contentment. She was accomplished, known throughout society for her intelligence and her charitable works. She was a devoted mother who was raising children who would, she hoped, carry forward the values of kindness and integrity that she and Victorian worked to instill in them. But most importantly, she was loved, truly, deeply, permanently loved by a man who had chosen her when she had nothing to offer but herself. And she loved him in return with a devotion that had only grown stronger with time and intimacy. Their marriage was not perfect, for no human relationship can be, but it was real and vital and enduring. One evening, as they sat together in the library at Blackwell Hall, the place where their love had first truly taken root, Victorian looked up from his reading and simply watched her for a long moment. When she asked what he was thinking, he smiled with that expression of wonder that still appeared sometimes when he looked at her, even after so many years. He told her that he had been contemplating how easily he might have missed her entirely. If he had not been at Blackwell Hall that particular winter, if he had not been on that particular street at that particular moment, if he had not pulled her from the path of that runaway coach, their lives might have gone in completely different directions. She might have disappeared into obscurity in Yorkshire, and he might have made some conventional match that would have left both parties dissatisfied. Liria set aside her own book and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. She told him that she had once believed herself to be a creature whom no one would ever value, that she had internalized the rejection she had experienced and come to see herself as Lady Constance had seen her. But he had taught her that she was wrong, that she possessed qualities worth celebrating rather than concealing. He had given her not just security or status, but the gift of seeing herself through eyes that loved what they saw. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other something rare and precious. Outside, the autumn wind was rising, but within the library all was warmth and light, and the quiet contentment of love that had weathered the storms of life and emerged stronger for the testing. Epilogue: 20 years had passed since that winter day when a runaway coach had nearly ended Liria's life and instead had delivered her into the arms of her destiny. She stood now at the window of the Blackwell Hall Library, watching the first snow of December dust the grounds with white, and marveled at how swiftly time had moved. In her mind, she was still sometimes that frightened girl clutching her small bag of belongings as she departed Fenwood Manor, uncertain of her future and convinced of her own inadequacy. But the woman reflected in the window glass bore little resemblance to that girl beyond the fundamental architecture of her features. At 43, Liria Blackwell, Countess of Ravenswood, had grown into herself in ways she could never have imagined in those dark days. Silver threaded through her dark hair now, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, but there was a serenity to her expression that youth had never possessed. She had learned over the years to see herself as Victorian saw her, to value the qualities that made her different rather than defective. Behind her she heard the door open, and knew without turning that it was her husband. After 2 decades of marriage, they had developed an almost uncanny awareness of each other's presence. Victorian crossed the room to stand beside her, his arm settling around her waist with the comfortable ease of long familiarity. He too bore the marks of passing years, his dark hair now more silver than not, but age had only made him more distinguished, more absolutely himself. They stood together watching the snow fall, and Liria thought of all that had transpired in these 20 years. Edmund was now a young man of 19, studying at Cambridge, and showing every sign of inheriting his father's brilliance along with his mother's compassion. He had spent the previous summer working with the estate stewards, learning the practicalities of management while also developing ideas for further improvements to the tenant school system that his mother had established. Catherine, at 17, was preparing for her first real season in London. Though she had already declared that she had no intention of marrying simply for the sake of marriage, she wanted what her parents had. She had announced with characteristic forthrightness, a partnership of minds as well as hearts. And if she did not find that, she would remain happily unwed and involve herself in the various charitable ventures that interested her. Liria had seen her own younger self in Catherine's determined independence and had assured her daughter that she would support whatever choice she made. There had been other children as well. Thomas, now 14, who had his father's analytical mind and a particular fascination with the natural sciences, and little Margaret, just 9 years old, who was bright as a button and already showing signs of having inherited her mother's love of literature. The house that had once seemed so vast and empty now rang with life and laughter, with the constant activity of a family that genuinely enjoyed one another's company. Fenwood Manor still stood under the nominal ownership of Victor Fenwood, but it was managed by the Ravenswood Estate Office and would pass to Edmund upon Victor's death. Victor himself had never married, had never recovered the status and prosperity his mother had believed was his birthright. He lived quietly at Fenwood, a somewhat melancholy figure who had learned too late the cost of his pride and his mother's cruelty. Liria had ensured he was comfortable, but they had never developed any real relationship beyond the most basic courtesy. The school that Liria had established had grown beyond her initial vision. It now served not just the children of Blackwell's tenants, but those from surrounding estates as well. 3 teachers worked there full-time, and they had developed a curriculum that was being studied and replicated by reformers in other parts of the country. Liria had discovered that she had a gift for identifying practical solutions to social problems, and her influence had extended far beyond the boundaries of her husband's estates. She had also, somewhat to her own surprise, become a published author. Her treatise on the education of children from agricultural families had been printed by a respected London publisher and had gained favourable notice from progressive thinkers. She wrote under her own name, Lady Ravenswood, and the work was taken seriously precisely because she wrote from direct experience rather than abstract theory. Victorian had been immensely proud, displaying the published volume in his library as though it were a great treasure. Their marriage had weathered the inevitable challenges that time brought. There had been moments of disagreement and frustration, times when their strong personalities had clashed rather than complemented each other. But they had learned over the years how to navigate such difficulties, how to communicate honestly, and to prioritize their partnership above individual pride. What had begun as passionate attraction had matured into something deeper and more enduring, a love that was as much friendship as romance. Victorian's career in Parliament had been distinguished, and Liria had been his partner in that work, as in all things. She had learned the art of political entertaining, of hosting dinners where important conversations could happen in seemingly casual settings. Her intelligence and discretion had made her someone whom politicians of various persuasions trusted, and she had quietly influenced policy in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged, but which had made real differences in people's lives. They had travelled together as well, visiting the continent once conditions permitted after the long wars. Liria had seen Paris and Rome, had stood in the great libraries and museums that she had only read about in her youth. These journeys had expanded her understanding of the world and had provided opportunities for intellectual growth that she treasured. But always, they had been happy to return to Blackwell Hall, to the place that had become the foundation of their shared life. Now, standing at the window with snow falling gently beyond the glass and her husband's arm warm around her waist, Liria reflected on the extraordinary nature of her journey. She had been rejected by those who should have protected her, had been cast out and left to fend for herself at a time when she was most vulnerable. But that rejection, painful as it had been, had ultimately led her to something far better than she would have found had she remained at Fenwood under Lady Constance's roof. She thought of the girl she had been, so convinced of her own inadequacy, so certain that she would never be enough for anyone. And she wished she could somehow speak to that girl across the years, to tell her that everything she believed about herself was wrong. She was not too tall, too serious, too intelligent, too plain. She was exactly right for someone who would value her not in spite of her differences but because of them. Victorian must have sensed the direction of her thoughts, for he turned her gently to face him. His silver eyes, still as striking as they had been 20 years ago, searched her face with the tender attention that had never diminished despite the decades of familiarity. He asked what she was thinking, and she told him, her voice thick with emotion, that she was thinking how grateful she was for that runaway coach, for his quick reflexes, for the chain of unlikely events that had brought them together. He smiled, that slow smile that still had the power to make her heart beat faster, and told her that gratitude was unnecessary. He was the one who should be grateful, for she had taken his life, which had been all intellect and ambition and coldness, and had filled it with warmth and meaning and love. Before her he had been successful but not truly alive. She had taught him what it meant to be fully human, to experience the complete range of emotions, rather than just the narrow band he had permitted himself. They kissed then, not with the desperate passion of new lovers, but with the deep affection of two people who had built a life together and found it good. When they drew apart, Liria rested her head against her husband's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. This, she thought, was what mattered. Not rank or fortune or society's approval, but this connection between two souls who had found each other against all odds and had chosen each day to continue choosing each other. The library door burst open, and Margaret came racing in, her young face alight with excitement, as she announced that the snow was deep enough for sledding, and would her parents please come watch. Catherine followed more sedately, but with a smile that suggested she was not too old to enjoy winter pleasures. Soon Edmund and Thomas would arrive home from their various pursuits, and the house would be filled with the cheerful chaos of family gathering for the holidays. Liria took Victorian's hand, and together they followed their daughter out into the snowy afternoon. As they walked through the halls of Blackwell Hall, past portraits of generations of Blackwells and rooms filled with the accumulated treasures of centuries, Liria thought that none of those treasures were half so valuable as what she possessed now. She had love, she had family, she had purpose and fulfillment. She had a husband who was also her dearest friend, children who brought her joy, and work that made a genuine difference in the world. Most importantly, she had learned to love herself. Not the idealized version that society might have preferred, but her actual self with all its supposed flaws and peculiarities. She had discovered that those qualities which had once seemed like defects were actually strengths when properly valued. Her intelligence, her seriousness, her independence of thought, these were not failures of femininity but essential parts of who she was. And being loved by Victorian had taught her that she was worthy of that love, that she deserved happiness and respect and partnership. As she stood in the snow watching her children play, with her husband's arm around her shoulders, and the winter sun breaking through the clouds to cast diamonds across the white landscape, Liria Blackwell felt a peace so profound it bordered on reverence. Her life had not followed any expected path. She had known rejection and hardship, uncertainty and fear, but through it all she had endured, she had survived. And ultimately she had triumphed not through revenge or bitterness, but through remaining open to love when it finally appeared. The snow continued to fall as the afternoon wore into evening, and the family made their way back inside to warm themselves before the library fire. Victorian read aloud from a novel while the children listened, and Liria worked at her needlework with Margaret curled against her side. It was an ordinary domestic scene, repeated in countless households across England, but to Liria it was everything. It was the life she had not dared dream of during those dark days after her father's death. It was proof that endings could become beginnings, that rejection could lead to something better, that love could be found in the most unexpected places. As the evening progressed and the children eventually drifted off to their beds, Liria and Victorian remained in the library, the room that had been the setting for so many significant moments in their shared history. He was working on correspondence, and she had returned to revising a new essay she was writing on agricultural reform. They sat in companionable silence, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other or discussing some point of interest. This, Liria thought as she paused in her writing to watch her husband's face, illuminated by lamplight, was what true love looked like. Not the passionate declarations of romance novels, though they had certainly had their share of passion over the years. But this quieter thing, this daily choice to share one's life with another person, to support their endeavors, to find joy in their company even when doing nothing more exciting than working at separate tasks in the same room. She remembered the advice her father had given her long ago, before Lady Constance had entered their lives. He had told her that the purpose of life was not to be perfect, but to be genuine, not to fit some prescribed mold, but to become fully oneself. At the time, she had not understood what he meant. But now, after years of living as her authentic self, alongside a man who loved that authenticity, she finally grasped the wisdom of his words. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, and Thorian looked up with a rueful smile, commenting that they had once again lost track of time. It was a common occurrence, this tendency to become so absorbed in their work and each other's company that hours passed unnoticed. They gathered their papers and prepared to retire, walking together through the darkened halls to their chambers. As Liria prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused for a moment. The woman looking back at her bore the marks of age and experience, but her eyes held a contentment that the younger Liria had never known. She thought of that girl in her shabby dress and worn cloak, trudging through the snow to her uncertain future at Mrs. Maple's boarding house. She wished she could tell that girl that everything would be all right, better than all right, that the pain she was enduring would not be permanent, that happiness awaited her if she could just hold on a little longer. Thorian appeared behind her in the mirror, and their eyes met in the reflection. He asked what she was thinking, and she told him simply that she was thinking about how fortunate they were, not fortunate in wealth or rank or any of the things society valued, though they certainly had those advantages, but fortunate in having found each other, in having built a life that brought them both joy and meaning. He agreed softly, pressing a kiss to her temple before drawing her toward the bed. As they settled together in the familiar comfort of their shared space, Liria felt a profound gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for the trials that had shaped her, for the rejection that had forced her to discover her own strength, for the chance encounter that had brought her to Thorian's attention, and for every day since that they had spent building this life together. She drifted toward sleep with Thorian's arms around her and the sound of snow still falling softly outside their window. Her last thought before dreams claimed her was that she had found what everyone seeks but few truly discover, a love that saw her completely, accepted her fully, and chose her daily. In the end, that was the only treasure that truly mattered, the only thing that could transform rejection into redemption and loneliness into belonging. The story of Liria and Thorian was not a fairy tale, for fairy tales end at the wedding, and real life continues far beyond that moment. But it was a love story, as genuine and enduring as any ever written. It was the story of two people who found in each other not completion, but complement, who built together something stronger than either could have created alone. And it was proof, if proof were needed, that the greatest love stories often begin not with love at first sight, but with one person seeing in another the worth that the world has overlooked. 20 years after that winter day when a runaway coach had nearly ended her life, Liria had everything she had never known to hope for. She had love, she had purpose, she had a family that filled her days with meaning. But most importantly, she had herself, fully realized and completely accepted. She was the Countess of Ravenswood, yes, but she was also simply Liria, beloved wife and devoted mother, author and reformer, friend and partner. And in being all these things, she had finally become the woman her father had always believed she could be. The snow continued to fall through the night, covering Blackwell Hall and its grounds in a blanket of pristine white. And within those walls, two people who had found their way to each other through darkness and difficulty slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. For they had learned through years of shared experience that love, true love, was not about perfection or passion alone. It was about partnership and patience, about choosing each other again and again through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life. And so their story continued, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a love well earned. The rejected daughter had become a beloved countess, not through any transformation of her essential nature, but through finding someone who valued her exactly as she was. And in that valuing, she had learned at last to value herself, to see with clear eyes the worth that had always been there, waiting to be recognized and celebrated. This was the greatest gift Victorian had given her, greater even than his name and rank and fortune. He had given her the gift of seeing herself as worthy of love, and in accepting that gift, she had discovered that she had been enough all along. The rejection that had seemed so devastating had ultimately been a blessing, for it had set her on the path to finding not just a husband, but a true partner, not just security, but genuine happiness, not just acceptance, but love in its truest and most transformative form. A message from Echoes of Romance. Dear listeners, dear friends of our channel, we have reached the end of Liria and Victorian's story, but perhaps it is also the beginning of something important that we must speak about together. You have just heard a tale of rejection and redemption, of a woman who was told she was not enough and a man who saw her true worth. But I want you to know something that comes from the deepest part of my heart. This story is not just about Liria. This story is about all of us who have ever felt rejected, overlooked, or deemed insufficient by the world's cruel standards. Perhaps you are listening to this while wondering if love will ever find you. Perhaps you have been hurt by those who should have cherished you. Perhaps you look in the mirror and see only flaws where you should see beauty. Perhaps you believe that your age, your circumstances, your appearance, or your past have somehow disqualified you from the kind of love that Liria and Victorian found. If any of these things are true, then please listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. You are wrong. You are beautifully, wonderfully wrong. True love does not care about age. It does not care whether you are 20 or 40 or 60 or 80. Love can bloom at any season of life, and sometimes the sweetest flowers are those that bloom latest, when we have finally learned to tend our own gardens with care. True love does not care about social position or wealth. The richest person is not the one with the most money, but the one with the most capacity for genuine connection. Your worth is not measured by your bank account or your address or the labels on your clothing. True love does not care about conventional beauty. The most attractive quality any person can possess is authenticity, the courage to be genuinely themselves. Those supposed flaws you worry about, they are the very things that make you uniquely you, the details that someone who truly sees you will treasure most. But here is the most important thing I want you to understand, the truth that Liria had to learn and that we all must discover for ourselves. True love begins with loving yourself. You cannot wait for someone else to come along and validate your worth, to tell you that you are enough, to give you permission to value yourself. That work, that crucial work of self-acceptance and self-compassion is yours alone to do. And until you do it, until you learn to treat yourself with the kindness and respect you deserve, you will struggle to recognize genuine love when it appears. Loving yourself does not mean being perfect. It does not mean never making mistakes or never having doubts. It means forgiving yourself for being human. It means acknowledging your wounds and giving yourself the grace to heal. It means recognizing that you are worthy of love, not because of what you achieve or how you appear, but simply because you exist. This is the journey we are all on, whether we realize it or not. We are all healing from something, learning from our past, becoming slowly and imperfectly the people we were meant to be. And that process, that journey toward wholeness, that is where true love lives. Not in perfection, but in the honest, difficult, beautiful work of becoming real. If you have been rejected, know that rejection is redirection. The people who could not see your value were never meant to be your people. The doors that closed were not your doors. Somewhere ahead, if you keep walking forward with courage and hope, there are people and opportunities and possibilities that are meant precisely for you. If you have been hurt, know that healing is possible. It may not happen overnight. It may require time and patience and sometimes help from others. But you are stronger than you know, more resilient than you believe, and more capable of transformation than you can imagine. If you feel alone, know that you are part of a vast community of people who understand your struggle because they have walked similar paths. We are all searching for connection, for meaning, for love. And in sharing our stories, in listening to tales like Liria's, we remind each other that we are not alone and that happy endings are not just for fairy tales, but for real people living real lives. The love you seek may not arrive in the way you expect. It may not wear the face you imagined or follow the timeline you planned. But if you remain open to possibility, if you continue to work on becoming the fullest version of yourself, if you refuse to let past hurts close your heart completely, then love will find you. Perhaps romantic love, yes, but also the love of friends, of family, of community, of purpose. All these forms of love are valuable, all are worth seeking and celebrating. Remember that your story is not finished. No matter how dark the current chapter seems, there are pages yet to be written. And you are the author of your own life, capable of choosing each day how you will respond to circumstances, what meaning you will make of your experiences, what future you will work toward. So be gentle with yourself. Be patient with your healing. Be brave in your hoping. And know that somewhere in this vast world there is love waiting for you, love in whatever form you need it most. But first, give that love to yourself. Learn to be your own champion, your own comfort, your own source of validation. And from that foundation of self-love, you will build a life that is rich and meaningful, whether or not it includes romance. You are enough. You have always been enough, and you deserve every good thing that life has to offer. Never let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Liria and Thorian's story. We hope it has brought you entertainment, certainly, but also comfort and perhaps a reminder of your own worth and potential. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to explore the other stories here on Echoes of Romance. Each one carries its own message, its own reminder that love and hope and healing are always possible. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story, and leave us a comment sharing your thoughts or your own experiences with love and self-discovery. Your words matter, your story matters, and we would be honored to hear from you. Until our next video, dear friends, remember to be kind to yourself, to remain open to love in all its forms, and to never give up hope. Your happy ending is still being written, and the best chapters may yet be ahead of you. With love and encouragement, Echoes of Romance.